Okay. So who's ready to hear some more C++ stuff? Raise your hand. All right. Well, this isn't a C++ talk, so you're in the wrong room. I think there are a couple of C++ talks going on. I won't be offended if you want to like skedaddle out of here, you know. This is a talk about something else. But anyway, like with C++ talks, just talking about them, there were a lot of Coroutines talks this year. And I've noticed that like every conference I go to, there's like at least 2 Coroutines talks. And the question I have is, how many Coroutines talks is enough? And I think the answer is, we don't know. We haven't had enough yet, because I don't get them. Do you get them? Like, I started looking at these Coroutines talks when they were going to the Standardization Committee, and I didn't get them then. I still don't get them now. I'll keep going to these talks. One day it'll snap in. So my name is David Sankel. I am at Adobe. I am a principal scientist there. I'm an active member of WG21. I am the chair of the board of the Boost Foundation. I do a bunch of stuff. But anyway, that's me. And this talk is Rules for Radical Engineers. All right? What the hell does that mean? Why this talk? So I've given a lot of software engineering talks. There's building software capital, so you inherited a large code base. C++ engineers wanted, programmers not so much, and most recently last year, up to code. And in these talks, I talk about great things, good practices to do, you know, coding standards, design reviews, doing cleanups to your code base, doing real code reviews, like not the LGTM ones, yeah, like real code reviews line by line, planning, education, development infrastructure, so all these great things. And I keep on getting, after these talks, like in the questions or sometimes in between, like comments along the lines of, yeah, that's great, but I don't know how to actually make that happen where I work. Or I've tried to make this happen where I work, and it totally failed. Basically, people have no idea how to make these changes happen in their organization. So this talk is trying to address this by answering that question. So you've tried to make these changes in your organization, and it hasn't worked. So you've got 2 options at this point, 2 paths, okay? First path is to come work at Adobe. That's a QR code. You can use it, and it'll take you to our, like, all kinds of information about the great C++ that we do at Adobe. But the talk would be short if that was the only option, right? So there's a question of, what are you going to do if you're not going to just go work at Adobe? And it's a big question. And it's not easy. It's not obvious what to do. So we're going to need some help. And we're going to do something kind of strange to get help with this. We're going to go outside of our field. By outside of our field, we're going way outside of our field. We're not talking about engineering. We're going into an area called political activism. Right? These are people who try to make changes in their societies based on, you know, various scenarios. Usually, the poor people are trying to get more power, or people are trying to get their grievances addressed and they can't do it. So there's this thing called political activism where you can kind of have a technique to make these things happen. So the first person we're going to talk about, the first political activist, is Saul Alinsky. This is a very cool guy, but he's kind of abrasive. But anyway, so he was around from 1909 to 1972. That's when he passed. He was a political activist, which means he actually did stuff, but he was also a theorist. And his focus in his life was on slums and ghettos. And his personal goal was to turn scattered, voiceless discontent into a unified protest. And he had a lot of success in Chicago slums, Rochester slums, and elsewhere. And he had a quote, and it's not fully showing up here, my bad, but change means movement, and movement means friction. So he was kind of a very in-your-face activist. He would be the kind of person that would, you know, go out there and make people uncomfortable in order to be able to get the kind of changes that you want to have. That's Saul Alinsky, and he wrote this book called Rules for Radicals, And I heard about this book in many different contexts, but I had never actually read it. And when I finally got to reading it, I was like, holy crap, this corresponds with my experience trying to make change happen within an organization. There were so many things in there that was like, yes, that's exactly how you do it, and mistakes that I've made. So this book is not for the faint of heart. Like I said, he's kind of abrasive. If you would not consider reading a book which is dedicated to the Satan, then you probably don't want to read this book because it's dedicated to Satan, kind of. But if you can get past that, there's a lot of really good techniques in there. So he is going to be one of our principal helpers in this journey of figuring out how to be a radical engineer. And then we also have Ella Jo Baker. Now, Ella Jo has a very different approach, but she was a civil rights activist. From 1903 is when she was born. She passed in 1986. And her focus was on grassroots organization and membership. So where Alinsky was more like organizing people, she was people organizing. And her goal was to give light and people will to find the way. Oh, give light and people will find the way. So essentially, she wasn't the in-your-face like leader of rallies and talking about like making these big speeches and stuff like that. She was really a behind-the-scenes activist, and she had success. She worked with like all kinds of names that you would recognize. Martin Luther King. She worked for the NAACP and SNCC, SCEF, etc. But really, you find out a lot about her, not from a book that she wrote, but from people that actually worked with her, some interviews that she gave, from the people that she mentored and was able to, and these people were able to go on and become successful political activists themselves. So these are our two guides. And we're going to start talking about stuff that is focused on Saul Alinsky. And then when we get towards the end, we're going to focus more on Ella Jo Baker's contributions to the field. All right. So on the left here, we have a software engineer, and on the right we have a boss. And the software engineer has some ideas, and the boss is just always like that. So many things going on at the same time, and so she's requesting to make some kind of a change, some kind of infrastructure change, some kind of improvement. And let's look at what the sprint board for this organization looks like, or this team. So the top thing on the sprint board is the issue of the week. What is the issue of the week? This is like when you get someone in the management chain who all of a sudden decides that something is important, and it comes all the way down to the engineers, and they're like, why are we working on this? But it's the #1 priority, so the issue of the week is the top thing to be worked on. Then after you have the issue of the week, you have the task, which is to save the company, because there's a major fire going on, things are burning, people are dying, the business is going to completely fall apart. That's the save the company issue. That's the second thing on your sprint list. The third thing is the 2022 major initiative, the big thing, that big push that everybody's really gung-ho about, that the management is all signed off on. And then after that, you're going to finish the 2021 major initiative. You know how that is. And then after that is what I call the fantasy zone. So the fantasy zone, this is where you put stuff that you're never going to do, right? But it's on the list, right? Every team has. I've seen stuff in the fantasy zone for years. It's still there, It's still on the list. We'll get to it someday, but not really. So when our engineer here goes to the manager and says like, hey, I'd like to do this thing, the manager's looking at all these different things, and he's like, okay, where are we going to put it? If she's lucky, the manager is going to say, no. We aren't going to do it. The answer is no, because of all these other things, right? That's if she's lucky. If she's unlucky, where's he going to put that sucker? In the fantasy zone, right? And that is so aggravating. That can make people really, really upset, because it's almost insulting, because everybody knows that nothing in the fantasy zone gets done. And that makes people upset. And here's that engineer just like really, really upset and angry. So this is not a new phenomenon. This has happened before. Let's talk about hippies. Hippies in the 60s. So Saul Alinsky complained a lot about hippies, because one of the things that was commonly done with hippies is they would have an event, or a rally or something like that, and the hippie will be like, throwing F-bombs and calling people pigs and all this other kind of stuff. And he had no problem with F-bombs. If you read his book, you clearly see that. He has no problems with calling people pigs, but what he does have a big problem with is ineffective political activism. So what he called this phenomenon is pointless, sure loser confrontation. Doesn't work, okay? So that's that. He suggests something else for communication. He says, communicate within the experience of your audience, right? You have to speak the words that they understand. If you start speaking in your own language, if in your little group you always call these people pigs or something like that, that's your local lingo, but then you go talk to these people and call them pigs, that's outside of their expertise. What are they going to do when they hear that kind of stuff? Brain just turns right off, right? They're not going to listen to what you have to say, so you better have some kind of power through some other means because that conversation is going nowhere. The second one is to work the system, right? The system exists. The system may suck, but it exists. It is the context from which you are doing your political activism. So you have to work given the context of the existing system. You can't just throw out the system and then get what you want. The system exists and you have to utilize it and take advantage of it in order to be able to get what you want. And the third item that Alinsky will suggest is to be patient and pragmatic. Change does not happen overnight. It takes time and it takes strategy. So here's a quote from Alinsky. He says, "Men don't like to step abruptly out of the security of familiar experience. They need a bridge to cross from their own experience to a new way." The implication there is, if you are a political activist, you need to build that bridge. So let's go back to our situation here. Let's say our engineer is trying to have a conversation with our manager. So she says, we need to adopt Abraham's value semantics in the code base to improve local reasoning and concurrency safety. So what's our manager going to say? Oh, what the hell is she talking about? Like local reasoning? I don't know what that means. And I'm not even going to ask the question because I don't have time and I don't care. Concurrency safety? What the heck is that? Like his brain is just like completely turned off. She's talking in a different language. It's like a Martian coming and saying blah, 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 blah. That's what he hears. All right, let's try again. What if she says, I propose a new waste reduction initiative that I estimate will reduce the dev expenditure by 15% in 2 years. Okay, tell me more. I'm listening. I calculated the amount of developer time spent on bugs that would be eliminated with a new technology called AVS. Why does that work? Why does that work better? And then he says, write up a draft proposal, and she says, I'm on it. So let's break it down. First thing is she used the word propose, right? She's working the system. This system and this environment works where people create proposals, they're vetted, they're modified, and eventually accepted. She's not demanding a change. She is using the vocabulary, she's using the system to say, hey, I'm making a proposal, all right? Waste reduction initiative. This is communicating with an experience. Every manager knows what it means to reduce waste. It's obvious. People walking down the street know what it means to reduce waste. It's obviously a good thing. People want to reduce waste because waste is bad, so let's get rid of it. So all of a sudden, he may not know like what exactly she's talking about, but it doesn't matter. You hit the right words and the interest is piqued. Waste reduction, good thing. And now the last one. I estimate this will reduce dev expenditure by 15% in 2 years. Now it's speaking to the desires of the audience in this case. So the manager in this case may not care about local reasoning and he doesn't even want to know what that means, right? But now we're talking about reducing a dev expenditure by 15%. That looks good for him, right? And in this case, there are numbers here. Numbers work extremely well to convince people of things. And it reduces the ambiguity. You don't have to buy into an ideology if you can prove things with numbers. And so in this case, she did the extra effort to calculate some numbers, and they don't have to be exact numbers to convince management. They really don't. Back of the envelope calculations work fine. And if you get, confronted like, hey, how did you come up with that number? You can explain it. This is how I did this estimation. Make sure you have an answer for that. But they don't expect it to be perfect. So this is the technique for communication. Now, I'm going to talk about an instance with Alinsky that's a bit hard to explain, so see if you can follow me, but this is an example of where he, in a poor black community, were able to utilize people's existing values. So this took place way back in I think it was in the 50s or maybe even 40s. So racial segregation was a really big deal. But it was at the time when no company would want to be attached to the word racist, right? Absolutely not. Now, they may have been racist all the way through, but they did not want to be attached to the word racist because that would be bad publicity. And so this was a black group that kind of got organized and got put together, and they wanted something from some of these department stores. And it doesn't really matter what they wanted, but they wanted something. And they decided that they were going to initiate a special kind of protest that was completely legal. See, another thing that they knew about the context of the time is that the people, like just general population, was extremely racist, right? And so what they planned on doing was for a big shopping day, like Black Friday or something like that, they said, okay, we're gonna plan this big rally, and what we're gonna do is we're gonna ship in buses and buses of people from the black community, and what they're gonna do is they're all gonna go to this one department store and go shopping, right? They're just gonna start walking through the store and looking at things and check the prices and maybe buy something that they take back the next day. And they knew that if they did that the white people that were all gonna go shopping that day, they would avoid that particular place. And they communicated this very publicly. We are planning this protest. And what ended up happening is the department store called them real quick and said, hey, whatever it is that you want to talk about, let's talk about it real quick. Please don't do that. And they got what they wanted. Perfectly legal, taking advantage of the existing context, but not just like looking at the rules and saying the rules suck, but using the rules, taking advantage of the racism of the people to get what they wanted in the end of the day. Now, this is very Alinsky style. Like I said, he's abrasive. I don't recommend you do this kind of thing to change your own organization, but the thinking process is very useful. Make sense? Okay, hopefully nobody will be pissed off at that one. All right, this is rule number one. Rule number one for radical engineers is to speak their language, all right? Let's move on to the next rule. Oftentimes when you want to make a change, it looks like this. You're one person that's trying to make a change and everybody is pushing in the opposite direction. I spoke with a gentleman yesterday who was talking about this in a company that he was working for. He was trying to push for some kind of changes, and it was just so hard if you're pushing by yourself. So rule number two for radical engineers is to get organized. That means bringing people along for the ride. And you getting a group of people to put their resources together, to work together as a unit to get things done. So the first corollary from this, if you want to get organized, you have something that you want to change, is to utilize existing structures. Maybe in your company you already have some kind of algorithms group or some kind of C++ group or languages group or something along these lines. It's an existing community of people. You can utilize them. You can go and talk with them and have them join into your initiative. That's a very easy thing to do. So like when Alinsky went out and tried to organize, to help organize these poor neighborhoods, he would go to the churches, he would go to various clubs, and he would bring them all together to join into a unified initiative. So that's a very useful thing to do. The second thing to keep in mind is that there may not be those kinds of structures. If they do not exist, then you should try to build them, right? Get together a group, start a group that's interested in making those kinds of changes. And the third one is to embrace a democratic process. What do I mean by that? So when you have a democratic process, it means you don't have one single person which is calling all the shots. And why would you want a democratic process and not have a single person calling all the shots? Well, first, a single person calling all the shots, they're going to end up making some bad decisions. And when they make some bad decisions, the people in the group are going to kind of like poo-poo the leader, right? One of the great pieces, one of the great things about the democratic process is that people have buy-in because they're part of the discussion. They're not just part of the discussion, they're part of the decision process. So they can say like, hey, I voted for this or I didn't vote for that. And it's actually one of the really cool parts about the C++ programming language is that it has this democratic process. And that's why it has a lot of people buying in because they got to participate. I do have some specific things that I want to say about a democratic process. These are things that, in my experience, have worked really well. The first of them is taking a straw poll. Now, some of you may already be familiar with straw polls and how they work, but for those of you who aren't, this is basically trying to figure out if there's consensus. And what you do is you ask people, what is their feeling about a particular proposal? Are you strongly in favor? Are you in favor? Are you neutral? Are you against? Are you strongly against? Or are you just like not participating in that vote? So here's an example straw poll. The poll is adopt circle-style metaprogramming. And in this case, they took a poll, and there were 14 strongly in favor, 3 in favor, 5 neutral, 0 against, and 1 strongly against. And oh, by the way, this particular methodology, I believe it was developed by Bryce Labach. This is what he uses for the library evolution working group, which is, I think, a very good method. You take down the attendance, so you can tell like how many people didn't vote. You see how many authors were present for the voting in case authors decide to like come in and crowd out the room. You can observe that. You can see what the author's positions are, which is interesting. And then you write down the outcome, which in this case, people are very strongly in favor of adopting circle-style metaprogramming, which I'm sure you all agree with anyway. And then we have the minority opinion. There was that one person who was like, no, I'm strongly against this because I'm concerned about security. Well, you give that one minority voter the option to state their position, and they state their position, and the discussion ends as soon as they state their position. Like, right there, no further discussion, they get the last word. And this, I think this method, and this can probably be refined, and there can be better ideas that build on this, but this is, I think, a great way to kind of like make decisions as a group in a democratic process. All right, on to rule number 3. Be pragmatic. This is a really important one. Saul Alinsky says, we must never forget that so long as there is no opportunity or method to make changes, it is senseless to get people agitated or angry, leaving them no course of action except to blow their tops. How many times have you seen this? A bunch of people getting together, they get really angry about something, they feel like they can't change anything, and they just kind of like flip out, and that's it. And when people flip out, going back to what we were talking about earlier, it oftentimes ends up hurting their cause more than helping their cause. So if you're going to get people together and you're going to build that agitation, which is a useful tool, make sure you have an outlet for that agitation. Take all that energy and be constructive with it and make the change happen that you want to have happen. So you got to be realistic. Here are some things that are probably unrealistic. Add unit tests to all existing code. If you have like any sizable code base, if you have 20,000 lines or something like that, this is gonna be a real tough sell. If you got 1 million lines of code base, just like forget it. Nobody's gonna fund stopping all work and just like adding unit tests to everything. Or maybe rewrite all existing code into whatever the language of the hour happens to be. That's probably not gonna work very well. Management isn't going to be able to buy that. I don't think you're gonna be able to get that, no matter how cool that will be. A 2x pay increase for all engineers? Ha 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 ha. Good luck. Or maybe like, let's spend a year addressing only technical debt, and the business stops like growing and like adding new features and being competitive. These are probably unrealistic. I don't want to say that they're unrealistic in all occasions, but these kinds of goals, you have to set your expectations to what is possible. So realistic, you could add unit tests to all new code. That's something that is probably possible to get done. You could add design reviews or code reviews. That can happen. Maybe instead of a 2x salary increase, you can get a team lunch. You could probably get a team lunch. Or maybe address a very specific technical debt problem. That can happen, right? So you have to think about what is realistically possible. So when I started the Bloomberg C Guild, we had a meeting, and this was like the first meeting. You know, everybody got together for the first time. We selected people from various areas throughout the company. Everybody was it was very representative of the different engineers at Bloomberg. And the meeting did not look like this. Are you kidding me? Like holding hands and all that kind of stuff? No. This is what the meeting looked like. People had very different opinions about the kind of stuff that we were going to be talking about. It was tough. And we started discussing the possibility of adding something to our coding guidelines. I think it had to do with when namespaces were used or something like that. And we realized really quickly, we can't do that. That is not within the possibility of this group right now, right? We were just getting started, and we didn't have that trust. We didn't have that camaraderie built at that time. And so we concentrated on the things that we could do, things that we did agree upon. For example, creating a library recommendations working group and things along these lines. And then over time, eventually the C++ Guild has gotten to a point where I think that they actually did make a decision on the namespace issue, and they can address even more ambitious issues that are very hard to get consensus on, like building a coding standard or things along those lines. So again, it's back to what is possible. Stick with what's possible. So here's a quote that I often repeat from Otto van Bismarck. He said, "Politics is the art of the possible, the attainable, the art of the next best." It's about making things happen that can happen. Not about, spouting out how to make this impossible thing happen, but about making incremental change, trying to make the thing better. That's what politics is about. So, we saw rule number 1, rule number 2, rule number 3, and now we have rule number 4. This is evolving the message. And this is a really key one. This was a cool insight that I got from reading Alinsky. So let's say you've got a Clang format interest group. Somebody got together, a bunch of people, and they're all like, hey, we need to make sure we have mandatory Clang format in our organization. And let's say they achieve their objective. Well, all that work that you put into like getting that group of people together just kind of goes away. They disband. They got what they wanted and they go home. That's not such a great outcome. You can utilize a group that you get together. There's work to create that thing, and that thing should be useful for more than just one outcome. So let's say you have these different people in your organization. So you got a Clang format group. There are people that care about build speed, some with C++20, unit tests, static analysis, design reviews. These are all different like communities of people that care about their own kind of special interests. Now the C++20 people, for example, let's say in this example, they don't really care about unit tests. I mean, it's like a nice to have, but they're not gonna do anything for unit tests. It's not really their thing. But if it was C++20, oh yeah, we're all into that. We want C++20 in the organization. So you as a community organizer, what can you do in this kind of situation? You take all these special interests and you combine them all together and you stew it all up and you come up with a phrase. In this case, code quality, right? Now what happens to all those people? They see that word and they see their special interest in it and they can rally behind it, right? Now we have a coherent unit, a coherent group, which is willing to do stuff. And as a group, you might say, hey, we're gonna do all kinds of things with code quality, but we decided that strategically, we're gonna start with claim format. What happens to this group? They still believe in the fundamental cause. They're like, claim format is part of the bigger thing of code quality, which includes C++20 and all these wonderful things. Now that entire group is all aligned and they're gonna attack claim format as a group. That's evolving your message. So Saul Alinsky said this, remember, once you organize people around something as commonly agreed upon as pollution, then an organized people is on the move. From there, it's a short and natural step to political pollution, to Pentagon pollution. You see what he did there? Right? He used the word and expanded it to different contexts to be able to take that work that was used to organize that community and then rally it towards other causes and keep it active and alive. So that's rule number 4. And now we're on to rule number 5, which is the last rule, build leadership. And here's where Ella Jo Baker comes in. She says, strong people don't need strong leaders. What does that mean? Basically, what she's talking about is you shouldn't be dependent on having some charismatic leader, some like big like Ruha that's like making everything happen. She didn't do that. Like I said, like that was not her strategy. She would build people up so they are strong, so they don't need a leader. They are strong themselves. That's how you make a lasting impact. So how do you do that? First, you got to recognize and address defeatist apathy. This is all over the place. Just talk with people. You know, people who've been in an organization for a really long time. It doesn't usually happen with like newer people, but people who've been around for 20 years, 10 years even. It's just like, yeah, it's pretty crappy, but you know, and they don't complete the sentence, right? It's nothing can be done really. Yeah, I've seen people try, nothing ever happens, you know, whatever. That's a terrible way of being. It's a terrible, I feel so bad for those people to feel so defeated and like nothing good can ever happen. You have to address that. And how do you address that? Well, one thing you can do is you can demonstrate a win early. Don't take on the world as your first step, right? Take on something that you think that you can actually do. And not just that you can actually do as like a community leader, but that you think that your group can do, that you think that your group can accomplish, and demonstrate to them that you can do it. So an example with Alinsky, with Alinsky, I don't recommend his exact things that he does, but they're instructive. So he would have, there was a situation to where he was organizing a rally to get a particular outcome. And the people called that he was rallying against to tell him that they were caving in. And so they had already caved, but he didn't tell that to his people. He's like, let's go ahead and have that rally. And then after the rally, he's like, they caved. And the people felt empowered, right? They felt like they did something. But don't lie to your people. Like, that's not nice. But you get the idea. The focus is on like getting these wins, getting people to feel like they can do something, that they can be empowered. And when you hear somebody say like, no, I can't do that, just say, oh, yes, you can. And back it up. You can do it. Make sure you feel confident that it can be done, but it's been done elsewhere. And we have good techniques, and we have good strategy. We can make this happen. We actually can. That's how you got to build people up into strong people, so they don't need strong leaders that they depend on all the time. So Charles Payne described Ella Jo Baker's approach like this. He said, if the attempt to organize the rally taught them anything about the mechanics of organizing, if the mere act of trying caused them to grow in self-confidence, if the organizers developed stronger bonds among themselves from striving together, then the rally may have been a success even if no one showed up for it. Again, the focus is not on getting that particular outcome, is building up the people so they can become stronger and have more ability to change things. A quote from Ella Jo herself. I have always thought what is needed is the development of people who are interested in not being leaders as much as in developing leadership among other people. And she rails against people who just want to be leaders. She really does. The people who just want to be out there up in front and like, hey, I want to have my name in the paper and all that kind of stuff. She's like, that's not how to do it. She took a very different approach and a very successful approach. And I very much agree with it. My experience has been similar. So how do you develop leadership? Again, don't depend on a single charismatic leader. You have to actively train other people. Like, leaders don't just kind of like pop out and they're great at it. I mean, it may happen every now and then, but anybody can really be developed into becoming a good leader. You have to actively train them. And just to give you like an example from my own experience, when we were starting the Bloomberg C Guild, a lot of the early papers that got produced had me as a co-author on it, but somebody else was the one that was writing it. They'd say like, hey, I've got this idea to do something. And I would say, that's fantastic. I want to help you with that. Well, you want to start a proposal? I'll give you a bunch of feedback. I'll contribute to it. Like, I will charge behind you, and you can run with it. And I did that like many occasions. And then eventually, I didn't have to do that anymore because they were training other people to develop that kind of leadership, that ability to run with a proposal. And that was awesome. That was really, really cool. And then the third one is to retreat in the background. Just like step back, gently step back, let them step forward. You don't need to be in front all the time. In fact, constantly be looking for opportunities to let your people experience what it's like to be in the front. That's developing leadership. That gets that skill, that self-confidence. And then the fourth one is nurturing other people's ideas. Like I mentioned, someone else has an idea. Great. I love it when it's not my idea. Love it when it's not your idea. And then just fan those flames. Like, run with it, run with it. Let me help you however I can. And it's wonderful to see people grow like this. So if you do this, your leaders should be able to leave. So with the C Guild at Bloomberg, as you know, I work for Adobe. I don't work for Bloomberg anymore, right? I went to Adobe in May, and I'm very happy at Adobe. But the Bloomberg C Guild didn't fall apart when I left. In fact, it was like almost unnoticeable that I left because I wasn't running meetings anymore, and individual leaders were doing awesome things. At this conference, there are 30 Bloomberg people, right? Many of them either a chair or a lead or a member or an associate member in the C Guild at Bloomberg. It's like totally awesome. And I'm extremely proud of what they're doing. Like, something that they've been doing since I left is they're establishing the New York C++ meetup, right? New York City doesn't have one. So they're building a New York City C++ meetup. Absolutely awesome. Their own initiative. They have the leaders. And I think that more things are going to come out of that organization. So now I gotta start working on doing some of the similar things at Adobe. But leaders should be able to leave. That's how you know you've been successful. And that's Ella Jo Baker's style. So, the 5 rules for radical engineers. Number 1, speak their language. Number 2, get organized. Number 3, be pragmatic. Number 4, evolve the message. And number 5, build leadership. So let's focus on C++ for a second. I kind of lied. We're going to talk about C++ a little bit. C++ needs to change. And anybody who tells you that C++ doesn't need to change is selling you something. What does it need? What needs to change in C++? Everybody's got their list. Algebraic data types would be nice. A more welcoming community would be great, especially among those who are like underrepresented. Have safety in the language. I think that's extremely important. We could have better libraries. We need a package manager. Yeah. How about the ergonomics of the language? Right now, C++ is extremely pointy. Like, you're going to cut yourself if you mess with it. There's reflection, value semantics, all these things. C++ needs to change. So what I would postulate is that C++ can change. I don't know how, but I don't need to know how. I know that people in this room can apply techniques and make these things happen, whatever it is that you want to make happen. And you can help. You can absolutely help. This isn't someone else's responsibility. This isn't like something that like, X person, Y person is going to do it. You can jump in and you can help make these things happen. So I have a challenge for you. The challenge is to be a radical engineer. And don't do it for yourself. Do it for the people around you. Thank you very much. So we'll be taking questions, comments. Wow. What does that mean? So it either means that I said it all, there's nothing else to be said, or it all went over your head and it was like a Coroutines talk. Okay, we got a question over here.
Hi, thanks for the talk, very interesting. You talk about building people, and I think that's very important, but some people really want to contribute, but don't have always the best ideas. What do you do in that case?
Okay, some people want to contribute, but they don't have the best ideas. What do you do about that? Well, I think that that's where nurturing and democratic process come into play. So the first part with nurturing is behind every idea, I think, is a legitimate grievance. It's very rare where there's not a legitimate grievance behind it. So saying like, start by agreeing with what the problem is, right? And then talking with them about how this doesn't work. Or different strategies that they can use. Like this happens all the time. I've encountered this. And a lot of times you can navigate them towards something that will actually get consensus. Now, if somebody is just like dead set, they have their own thing, well, the democratic process is going to kind of like shut that down. And they'll get the actual feedback that like, look, whatever you said, it didn't convince all these people. So let's work on that. Question over here.
Yes, so you gave some rules, and of course we know that rule is not a real rule if it doesn't have exceptions. So what are the top exception cases that come to your mind relative to those rules? And maybe like a second, somewhat related question, like if you would do something differently about, if you could do something different about setting up the C++ guild, like what would that be like? What would you go back and correct?
Sure. So every rule has exceptions. I'm not sure about that premise, but I think that something that Alinsky will definitely tell you is that you have to constantly adapt. The situation will change. Like for example, maybe there's a situation where democratic leadership is just going to take way too long, and maybe you need to do something which has leaders and is going to make things happen more quickly. So that would be an example of that. Things that I regret with the C++ Guild, there's like 8 million mistakes that I made, and I couldn't enumerate all of them, and it'd be even hard to enumerate some of them, but every single one of these mistakes was beneficial, right? Because I got to learn something, I got to do something better. There was never any mistake that was made that was completely fatal. And like they say, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Question over here.
Yes, in your time, what have you found makes people less apathetic, more likely to join your group or to get the ball rolling, so to speak?
So I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question.
Sorry. Can you give any recommendations on how to help encourage people to be less apathetic towards their own causes, to get people to join your group initially?
Yeah. So the question is, how do you get people to have less apathy? And like I mentioned before, it's really demonstrating something. So, back at Bloomberg, there was, a particular personality that had some very strong opinions. And people thought that it would be absolutely impossible to change this person's mind on anything. And I worked and worked and worked. And on a very small thing, I was able to change this person's mind on something. And I just held that up and was like, look, it can happen. You can't tell me that it can't happen. You can happen. Now, was it worth it? I don't know. But I think it was worth it to at least prove that the change can happen. And that's a first step towards that. So hopefully that helps answer that question. Question over here.
We have a question online.
Oh, question online.
With the democratic process, how do you inevitably avoid design by committee?
How do you inevitably avoid design by committee? When people say that, they usually mean that the design that got created looks very ugly if you look at it from an idealistic standpoint. And that's true. I was having a conversation with Bill Hoffman a couple days ago, and I asked him, how did CMake become so successful? Like, if you use CMake, one of your first reactions is like, this is an ugly thing, right? But it took over the entire industry. It is so popular. How did that happen? And I asked him, and he said, well, when people said that it didn't work in this situation, it didn't work in that situation, we added a feature, we made it work, right? He ended up with something that works almost everywhere. And they continually improve it, and it's getting better and better. But the art of compromise means that you create something that works for the most amount of people. And sometimes that isn't the most beautiful thing in the world. But at least you got something that works with most people. So, it's a trade-off. There will be some trade-offs with that. Question, over here.
Oh, hi, thanks for the talk. I think it's really great to introduce these things in the context people aren't used to hearing them. I think I have a question about the code on your third slide. If you could go to that. Legitimately.
You have a question about the code on the third slide?
I think it was the third slide.
I can't go backwards, man. I'm using a new presentation software.
Oh,
Can you vocalize it?
So you enumerated that in these situations there are two choices. And
Yeah.
the second choice is the one that you've been talking about. But the first choice is to leave. And I've been in organizations where those political action committees existed, but they were going in the wrong direction. And I wonder if you could comment on when you decide that instead of trying to affect change, you just go find another organization.
Yeah. That's tough. When do you give up? And I don't have an answer to that. I don't really know. The default answer is we'll just go ahead and work for Adobe. That'd be fantastic. Love to have many of you great software engineers at Adobe. But there's no, if you leave the people behind that you were with, right? And if you think about some of the situations that Alinsky and these other activists were in, they could have given up and left and just well, let's go to a different city or let's go to a different country or something like that. But there's always people left behind. And then they have to deal with it. So it's really a deeply personal question about what your values are. And I don't fault anybody for leaving. But if you care about the people enough, you'll probably want to stay and affect the change.
So it's kind of a similar question to that, but before you're ready to give up and leave, you see your peers in that group that you've created just kind of fizzle out and lose interest in the change that you want. How do you address that?
So before you leave, you see people fizzle out and just kind of zone out, whatever. How do you address that? I think the way to address that is to be an agent of change yourself. You kind of need to have somebody with confidence. That's kind of the spark. You need somebody to say, yeah, no, we can change this. I've seen many dire situations, and the people that we're talking about, these political activists, their dire situations were way worse than what I've seen. But they were able to successfully go in and successfully rally people and successfully make the changes happen. So when you see that, be the change that you want to see, right? Be that radical engineer. And people will follow. They will. They'll be interested in it. It'll take time, but you can do it.
We have another question online. In a large organization, how do you get the right representation for a democratic process? Too many results in death by committee, too few, there's no buy-in, omit some key individuals, the buy-in fails again.
That's a good question. So the first thing that I will say is that when we created the C++ Guild at Bloomberg, the initial roster of people were all people that I knew, right? And that was a big problem because the people that I knew were in similar circles to me, had similar experiences, and were not representative of the entire organization. So I had to search. I found excuses to fly out to the Lugano office, and I just went to that office and I said, hey, who's your best C++ person here? And they pointed me to somebody that I had never met, completely different context, working on Windows stuff, and I was working on Linux stuff. Adam Locke is his name, and he ended up becoming a chair of the C++ Guild. So you have to try to make sure that you have diversity in your group. The second comment with regard to that is, I forget. You only get the first one. Okay, question over here?
Yeah. In my experience, programmers, we're all used to being masters of our domain, right? How do you deal with programmers who flatly refuse to accept the democratic process? I've seen companies fail to adopt Clang format because one programmer didn't like the way it formatted his switch statements. I've seen companies fail to adopt Git because one programmer thought it didn't fit his workflow. And the obvious question about your circle slide is, why don't we have circle metaprogramming in the language if it was so much in favor?
I invented the numbers on the circle slide. It went the other direction. But you're not going to get everybody, right? You're going to have to accept that. And when I was making that slide with little people, I thought about taking one of those people and just putting them off to the side because for whatever reason they couldn't work in a group. It does happen. But don't let that stop you, right, from getting the things done. You don't have to get everybody to agree with something. You just need to get enough people and to communicate things. Like let's say you have the situation where you have a lead architect or something like that, and they're making all the decisions about coding standards, and the decisions frequently are really bad. And you're coming up with a group and you're trying to affect change. So you go to that person and you say, hey, talking from their vantage point, I have an idea on how I can help you make really good decisions. And the idea is to bring together a group of people, representative of different people in engineering, who can come to a consensus on various decisions, and then you can use that as input to help you make your godlike decision because you're a Mr. Architect person or Mrs. Architect person. The person can't say no. They might be like, dang, I really wish that this isn't happening, but they can't say no, right? And then you go into it and then it's like, okay, everybody is in favor of something, and the lead architect is like, no, I want to shut this thing down. They're going to hesitate to make that decision because it'd be like, that lead architect, just made a decision that went against the opinions of the entire advisory group. That's kind of curious. So that'd be one way to deal with that situation.
like the method you presented or how you did it kind of makes heavy use of social identity, like the theory in psychology. That's nice because you can get a lot of people moving, and I totally believe you got the success you had. But it has like kind of a dark corner that you kind of get into groupthink. Because all the people now have these shared goals and the shared identity and kind of feel like this is their overarching thing they have to push. It might silence critics. Have you had any experience or have you tried anything to kind of guard against groupthink so that you still get critique when you need it, like someone to speak up?
I so love that you asked that question. Thank you so much. What do you do about groupthink? So Alinsky has an interesting opinion about this. He says that you have these have-nots, right? And they want to get the power from the haves. And then eventually, they get the power from the haves, but there's a new group of have-nots, and they need to politically organize. So at some point in the lifetime of an organization, if it gets a lot of power, there is going to be that groupthink, and there is going to be that need for change. And if you set up a democratic process, at least you have a context for that change to happen. But someone else may need to come up, or a group of people may need to come up and politically organize and become activists to change the previous group that did a bunch of great things, but then stagnated and did bad things after that. So I don't think there's a way of preventing it. I don't know of any organization which has lasted thousands and thousands of years that has been able to keep it up and like doing good things all the time. So there's that.
Another question online.
Online question.
After a group like the C++ Guild has been going for a while, how do you keep the momentum up? At my company, our group already handled a lot of low-hanging fruit, and now we have a hard time making progress on the harder problems.
So how do you keep the enthusiasm going? I think that you have to, well, so Alinsky would say you have to keep on changing your target. You know, you find like some like evil enemy nemesis thing and then move it to the next one and move it to the next one. In his opinion, you got to always keep on like fighting and fighting and fighting. And I think that's true. Like there has to always be that spark. If that spark disappears, then the group is going to kind of fall apart, right? Which maybe is okay. Maybe it's time for another group to come up. But to extend the influence, I think that you got to keep on moving and keep on striving, keep on trying.
So kind of related to Ben's question and maybe some of the other questions as well, was what do you do about in a democratic process, you often end up having kind of some squeaky wheels, so to speak. Some people that they may have a minority opinion, but they proclaim it very loudly and repeatedly and kind of drown everyone else out. How do you approach that as leading these groups?
Yeah, so what do you do if you have someone that's loud, drowning everybody out, kind of giving a bad feeling? So when we created the C++ Guild, we were very intentional with who we selected. And we had a rule that we informally called the no a-hole rule, where if people had a reputation of not working well in group settings, they wouldn't be invited to be part of the guild. But that only brings you so far. I think that it's probably a topic on itself about how to have an inclusive meeting to where people feel like they have the opportunity to voice their concerns and it doesn't get drowned out all by one person. For example, taking names of people who raise their hand and then going based on the list and disallowing interruption. So that's like a useful tool to make that happen. And there are other things that you can do. But it's a struggle. There are techniques that you have to try to apply and you learn and you see what works, what doesn't work. But yeah, loudmouths are a problem. I'll give you that. Okay, one more question.
All right. Yeah, thanks for the great talk. So I encountered these meetings, group organizations that were set up to enact change, but ended up with political infighting. What's your opinion on that? I mean, I guess there is no recipe to prevent that, but I'd love to learn your opinion.
Yeah, political infighting. So in the organizations that I've been part of so far, I haven't actually seen a lot of that. Because there was a lot of like, people were very united around causes, but there was political infighting like with particular proposals, and one group wanted this, one group wanted that. And those things were kind of, we tried to like limit their blast radius, right? So there might be like one particular working group where there's a lot of like fighting, but let's not let that spill over to the entire organization. Let's let people, be, holding hands over there, but maybe disagreeing over in this other spot. And if it doesn't work, if there's something that you're trying to do and there just isn't enough consensus and people are arguing with each other, you could just drop it. Maybe that's not the thing at the top of the list to be working on. But it's a legitimate concern for sure. All right, so we are done with questions. Thank you all very much. You've been an awesome audience. See ya.